The water at Blackwood's Crossing ran darker than Ben Carter remembered. Summer had settled over Montana with a weight that pressed down on everything, turning the river sluggish and deep. He stood on the bank where the Sweetwater River bent like a question mark, staring at the exact spot where 15 months ago, a 7-year-old boy had died in his arms. Ben had ridden 3 days to get here, crossing from Wyoming through high country where the air thinned and the silence grew so complete he could hear his own heartbeat. Each mile closer to Millbrook had felt like wading through mud, his horse sensing the reluctance in every shift of weight, every hesitation before urging her forward again. The letter sat folded in his shirt pocket, the paper soft from being read and reread until he could recite the words from memory. Ruth Mitchell's handwriting had been shaky, but clear. Each letter formed with the careful precision of someone who understood the gravity of words committed to paper. My husband is dying. He has asked for you. Please come if you can find it in your heart. Ben had told himself he wouldn't come, had convinced himself during those first 2 days after the letter arrived at the work camp that showing his face in Millbrook would only bring more pain to people who had suffered enough because of him. But the letter had found him anyway, delivered by a writer who tracked him through 3 counties, and something in those simple sentences had pulled at him with the inexorable force of the river current he still felt in nightmares. He owed the Reverend, owed him more than he could ever repay. The sun hung low in the western sky now, painting everything in shades of amber and gold that seemed too beautiful for a place that held such terrible memories. Ben closed his eyes and saw it all again with the vivid clarity that had haunted every sleeping and waking moment since that day. Daniel Mitchell had been 7 years old with hair the color of summer wheat and a laugh that sounded like bells. The Reverend had asked Ben to teach the boy to fish, trusting him with his only son, the way people in small towns trusted their neighbors with the things that mattered most. It had been a perfect day, the kind that made you believe in the goodness of creation, with clear skies and cool water, and the boy's endless questions about everything from why fish had scales to whether heaven had rivers. Ben had been showing Daniel how to cast standing close behind him, guiding small hands on the fishing pole when the boy had stepped forward into water that looked shallow but dropped away sudden and steep. The current had been stronger than it appeared, fed by mountain snowmelt that made the river run fast and cold beneath its placid surface. Daniel had gone under before Ben could grab him. By the time Ben dove in, the boy was already being pulled downstream, small arms flailing in panic. Ben had swum hard, harder than he'd ever swum in his life, lungs burning, arms fighting against water that seemed determined to claim them both. He'd reached Daniel, gotten his arms around the small body, felt the desperate grip of a child who understood he was drowning. But the river had been stronger. Ben had tried. God knows he had tried. He'd kicked against the current, pulled with everything he had, fought his way toward the bank that seemed to recede with every stroke. Daniel's weight had been both impossibly light and impossibly heavy, a burden that defied the laws of physics because it carried the weight of a life depending entirely on Ben's strength. And Ben's strength had not been enough. By the time he dragged Daniel's body onto the muddy bank, the light was already leaving those blue eyes. Ben had pounded on the small chest, blown air into lungs that wouldn't accept. It performed every technique he'd learned during his years in the Army. But the river had already won. The boy was gone before Reverend Samuel Mitchell arrived, before the father fell to his knees in the mud and cradled his dead son with a sound that no parent should ever have to make. Ben had waited for the accusation, for the rage, for the righteous fury of a father who had lost everything because Ben Carter hadn't been fast enough, strong enough, good enough. It never came. Instead, the Reverend had looked up at Ben with tears streaming down his weathered face and said words that had burned themselves into Ben's soul like a brand. You tried to save him. That's all anyone can do. Try. The forgiveness had been worse than any condemnation. Ben had left Millbrook that same night, unable to bear the weight of mercy he didn't deserve. For 15 months, he drifted from town to town, ranch to ranch, taking work where he could find it and moving on before anyone could ask questions about the hollow look in his eyes or the way he flinched at the sound of running water. Every night he dreamed of the river. Every morning he woke reaching for a child who wasn't there. Now he was back standing at the crossing where it had all happened, and the water moved past him like it had never taken anything, like it didn't remember what it had done. Ben opened his eyes and forced himself to look at the river properly. The afternoon sun struck the surface, making it sparkle and dance beautiful and deadly. He should move, should get to town before dark. But his feet felt rooted to the earth, and the guilt felt heavier than gravity. That's when he saw them. Two small figures sat near the water's edge, maybe 30 yards downstream from where Ben stood. Children. His heart seized in his chest. For one terrible, irrational moment, his mind showed him Daniel alive and well, playing by the river like he had that last day. But these weren't ghosts. These were real children, solid and present in the fading light. Two girls, one larger than the other, sitting perfectly still as the shadows lengthened around them. Ben's first instinct was to turn around to climb back on his horse and ride away from anything that reminded him of what he'd failed to protect. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the stillness of the scene. Maybe it was the way the smaller girl's head rested on the larger one's lap. Maybe it was the simple, terrible fact that children should not be sitting alone by a river at dusk. He walked toward them slowly, boots crunching on the dry grass that lined the riverbank. As he got closer, he could see them more clearly. The older girl looked to be 8 or 9, with dark hair pulled back in a braid that had mostly come undone. Her dress was faded calico patched at the elbows, with fabric that didn't quite match. She sat with her back straight, watching the water, with eyes that seemed too old for her face. The smaller girl, maybe 5, had golden curls and a round face still soft with baby fat. She was asleep, curled against her sister, like a kitten seeking warmth, one small hand clutching the fabric of the older girl's dress. The older girl heard him coming. She turned her head slowly, and Ben stopped walking. There was no fear in her eyes, no surprise, just a kind of weary assessment, as if she was used to strangers approaching and had learned to measure their intentions quickly. Ben cleared his throat. He suddenly didn't know what to say. "Are you lost?" The words came out rougher than he intended, his voice rusty from days of not speaking to anyone but his horse. The girl didn't flinch. Her green eyes studied him with an intensity that made him feel like she could see right through to all the broken places inside. "No, sir. We're waiting for what someone to come." Ben looked around. The road that ran past the crossing was empty in both directions. The nearest homestead was 3 miles back. The sun was dropping fast toward the horizon, and soon it would be full dark. "Who are you waiting for?" The girl's expression didn't change. She had the kind of face that had learned early not to give anything away, to hold emotions close and protected. "I don't know, but our papa said someone would come." Ben felt ice slide down his spine despite the warm evening air. "Where's your papa now?" "He had to go. He's sick." "Where did he go?" The girl looked back at the water, and for the first time Ben saw a flicker of something that might have been fear or might have been resignation. He didn't say. Ben crouched down so he was at eye level with her. The movement made his knee crack, a reminder of old injuries and hard living. The girl noticed but said nothing. "What's your name, Grace?" "This is my sister Lily. How long have you been sitting here, Grace?" "Since morning." Ben looked at the sleeping child, then back at Grace. Her face remained calm, but he could see the exhaustion in the set of her shoulders, the way she held herself too still, as if any movement might shatter the fragile control she maintained. "Since this morning, have you eaten?" Grace gestured to a small cloth bag beside her. "Papa left us some bread and water." Ben's jaw tightened. He had seen enough of the world to know what this was, what this looked like. A father who couldn't provide, leaving children somewhere visible, somewhere they might be found. It happened more often than people wanted to admit, especially in hard times when drought or sickness or simple bad luck could strip away everything a family had. But something didn't sit right. If the father wanted them found, why here? Why a river crossing miles from town in a place where traffic was sparse and darkness came with teeth? "Did your papa say anything else?" Grace studied him for a long moment. Her eyes were green and sharp, searching his face like she was reading words written there that he couldn't see himself. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady and clear. "He said to wait here, to wait. He said someone good would come and we should give them this." She pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. The edges were worn as if she'd been holding it all day, running her fingers over it, preparing for this moment. She held it out to Ben. Ben didn't take it immediately. "I'm not sure I'm the someone your papa meant." Grace's hand didn't waver. "You're here, aren't you?" The simple logic of it hit him harder than any argument could have. He was here. Out of all the places he could have been, all the roads he could have taken, he was standing at this river crossing at this exact moment when 2 children needed someone. Ben reached out and took the paper. He unfolded it carefully, and even in the fading light, he could read the cramped, uneven handwriting of someone whose hands weren't steady. To whoever finds my daughters. Their names are Grace and Lily Harper. I am their father, James Harper, and I am dying. I have no means to care for them and no family to take them. If you have any kindness in your heart, please see them to safety. Take them to the church in Millbrook. Reverend Mitchell will know what to do. I pray God forgives me for this. Ben read it twice, the words sinking in with a weight that felt physical. He looked at Grace again, this small child sitting by a river, with the kind of composure that spoke of burdens no 8-year-old should have to carry. Your papa thinks he's dying. Grace nodded, and for the first time, Ben heard the tremor underneath the steady surface. He has the black sickness in his leg. It's been spreading, gangrene, Ben thought. If it was advanced, the man had days, maybe a week, and he'd spent that precious time bringing his daughters here to this specific place and leaving them with nothing but a letter and a prayer that someone good would come. And he left you here alone, Bon. Grace's voice remained steady, but Ben heard what lived beneath the words. He said someone would come. He said it would be today. Ben stood up, his mind racing. The sun was almost touching the horizon now. In an hour it would be full dark, and these girls couldn't stay here overnight. He couldn't leave them, but taking them meant going to Millbrook, meant facing the town that knew him as the man who had failed to save Daniel Mitchell, meant walking back into the life he'd spent 15 months running from. He looked down at Grace again. She was watching him with those two old eyes, waiting for him to make a choice. The sleeping child, Lily, stirred slightly and murmured something in her sleep, and Ben saw it, then saw Daniel's face superimposed over Lily's, saw the same vulnerability, the same innocent trust that the world would keep them safe. He had failed one child. The river had taken Daniel despite everything Ben had done, despite every ounce of strength and will he'd thrown against the current. But these children weren't in the water. They were on solid ground, and he was here. He was standing right here, and he had a choice. I'll take you to Millbrook, to the church like your papa said. Grace's shoulders dropped slightly as if she'd been holding her breath. Thank you, sir. Ben moved to wake Lily, but Grace stopped him with a small hand on his arm. Her touch was light but insistent. Wait, there's something I need to ask first. Ben paused. What Grace looked at him with an intensity that seemed to cut through all pretense, all the walls people built around themselves. She had learned to read people the way most children learn to read books, out of necessity, out of survival. Are you running away from something? The question hit Ben like a fist to the chest. He opened his mouth to deny it, to ask what business it was of hers, but something in her eyes stopped him. This child had learned that the world didn't always offer gentle truths. She would know if he lied. Yes, I am. Grace nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected, something she'd seen in the way he stood, or the way he'd approached them, or the shadows that lived behind his eyes. So are we. Ben felt something shift in his chest, some recognition, some understanding that passed between them without need for more words. They were both running, both waiting, both hoping that someone somewhere would choose to stay instead of walking away. Grace gently shook her sister awake. Lily's eyes fluttered open, confused and cloudy with sleep, not quite sure where she was or why someone was disturbing her rest. Time to go, Letty. This man is going to help us. Lily looked up at Ben with wide blue eyes that reminded him too much of Daniel, too much of innocence that trusted too easily and could be taken too quickly. Are you Papa? No, honey, I'm just someone who stopped. And that was true. That was all he was, someone who had stopped running long enough to see two children who needed help. But as he lifted Lily onto his horse and helped Grace climb up behind her, Ben couldn't shake the feeling that stopping here at this river on this day was going to change everything. They rode into Millbrook as the last light was dying. The town looked exactly as Ben remembered, like 15 months had passed in the blink of an eye, and nothing had changed except him. Main Street stretched out with its false-fronted buildings that promised more than they delivered, the general store with its paint peeling in long strips, the saloon where piano music drifted out into the evening air, along with the smell of whiskey and tobacco smoke. The church stood at the far end of town, its white steeple rising against the darkening sky like a finger pointing toward heaven or judgment or both. People turned to stare as they passed. Ben kept his hat pulled low, but he knew they recognized him. News traveled fast in small towns, and a man who'd let the Reverend's son drown would be remembered, cataloged, filed away in the collective memory as a cautionary tale about trust misplaced. He heard the whispers, saw the fingers pointing, felt the weight of judgment pressing down like the summer heat. But he kept riding Lily in front of him, Grace's arms wrapped around his waist to keep from falling. The girls needed help. Whatever these people thought of him didn't matter right now. It couldn't matter. Ben stopped in front of the boarding house run by Mrs. Dorothy Hayes. It was the closest thing to neutral ground he could think of, a place where strangers were expected and gossip was currency, but kindness still occasionally broke through. He dismounted and helped the girls down. Grace stood close to Lily, protective, even now, even exhausted and scared, and uncertain of what came next. Ben tied his horse and walked up the steps to knock on the door. Mrs. Dorothy Hayes answered. She was a solid woman in her 60s with iron gray hair pulled back severe from a face that had seen enough of life to be skeptical of most of it. Her eyes missed nothing, cataloging Ben's appearance, the girls behind him, the dust on their clothes, and the weariness in their posture. When she saw Ben, her expression hardened like cooling steel. "We're full." The words were flat, final, a door closing before it had fully opened. "I'm not here for a room for myself." Ben kept his voice steady. "These girls need a place to stay. Their father left them. They need food and beds and someone to watch over them until I can sort this out." Mrs. Hayes looked past Ben to where Grace and Lily stood on the steps. Her expression softened slightly, the way even the hardest hearts sometimes did when confronted with children in need. "Harper girls." Ben was surprised. "You know them? Know of them?" James Harper's been struggling since his wife died. Word was he'd taken sick. Her eyes moved back to Ben, and her face went carefully blank, the way people's faces did when they were about to say something that needed saying but wouldn't be welcomed. "I see you've got nerve coming back here, Carter." "I know, but these girls need help tonight. Whatever you think of me, don't take it out on them." Mrs. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, and Ben could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the weighing of judgment against compassion, of community standards, against basic human decency. Then she sighed, a sound that carried the weight of years and experience and too many hard choices. "Bring them in. I'll get them fed and settled." She pointed a finger at Ben, and the gesture carried all the authority of a schoolmarm or a judge or someone who'd learned to command through sheer force of will. "But you stay where I can see you. I don't trust men who run away." Ben nodded and gestured for the girls to come inside. Grace took Lily's hand and led her past Mrs. Hayes into the warmth of the boarding house, and Ben followed, feeling the weight of the woman's suspicion like a hand on his shoulder. The boarding house smelled of lye soap and cooking oil, of lives lived in close quarters and secrets kept behind thin walls. Hayes led them to a small room on the first floor, barely big enough for the narrow bed inside. A washstand stood in the corner with a chipped pitcher and basin, and a single window looked out onto Main Street, where the evening traffic was starting to thin. "They can share this tonight. I'll bring up some stew and bread." Mrs. Hayes looked at the girls with something that might have been kindness under all the practical efficiency. "You two wash your hands and faces. Basin's on the dresser." As the girls moved to obey, Mrs. Hayes pulled Ben aside into the hallway, her grip on his arms surprisingly strong for a woman her age. "What's your plan here, Carter?" Ben kept his voice low, aware of the girls just on the other side of the thin door. "Their father's letter said to bring them to Reverend Mitchell." "I'm going to do that." Mrs. Hayes' face went pale, and Ben felt a cold dread start to build in his stomach. "You don't know what—" "The Reverend, he's dying. Had a stroke 2 weeks ago. He's bedridden. Can't speak. Barely conscious most days." The words hit Ben like a physical blow. The letter, Ruth's letter, had said her husband was dying, but Ben had been so focused on his own guilt, on the prospect of facing the man whose son he'd failed to save, that he hadn't really processed what it meant. "Is there someone else? Someone who handles orphans or children who need help?" Used to be the church. Now Mrs. Hayes shrugged, and the gesture spoke volumes about small-town resources and big-town problems. "Sheriff might know, or the territorial judge when she comes through, but that could be weeks." Ben ran a hand through his hair, feeling the trap starting to close. Weeks. These girls couldn't wait. Weeks couldn't be shuttled between temporary arrangements while bureaucracy ground forward at its own pace. "There's one other person who might help." Mrs. Hayes said it slowly, like she was testing each word before committing to it. Though I'm not sure if that's a blessing or a curse. Who Edward Thornton runs the big ranch north of town. He takes in orphans, sometimes puts them to work, but he feeds them and houses them. Ben nodded slowly. I'll talk to him tomorrow. Mrs. Hayes's hand caught his arm again, her fingers digging in with surprising urgency. Carter, be careful with Thornton. He's not what he seems. Before Ben could ask what she meant, footsteps sounded on the stairs. A man appeared at the top, descending slowly with the careful movements of someone who carried more than just physical weight. He was older, maybe 63, with silver hair and the kind of clothes that spoke of money, the quiet, expensive kind that didn't need to announce itself. His face was lined with grief, the kind that settled into a person's bones and never quite left, that changed the architecture of expressions and carved permanent shadows under the eyes. Mrs. Hayes. The man's voice was cultured, educated, carrying the slight formality of someone who'd been raised to observe proprieties, even in casual moments. I heard there were Harper girls brought into town. Is it true? Mrs. Hayes's grip tightened on Ben's arm, a warning or a preparation for something? It's true, Mr. Thornton. The man's eyes found Ben, and something flickered in them that Ben couldn't quite name. Recognition, certainly. Judgment, probably. Something else that felt almost like calculation. And who are you, Ben Carter? The name hung in the air between them, and Ben saw the moment Thornton placed it, connected it to the stories that must have circulated through Millbrook, like smoke through rooms. You're the one who brought them in. Yes, sir. Thornton looked toward the room where the girls were. May I see them? Ben stepped in front of the door, instinct overriding uncertainty. With respect, sir, I don't know who you are. I'm not letting strangers near them until I understand what's happening here. Thornton's mouth tightened, but something that might have been approval crossed his face there and gone like a shadow passing over water. That's fair. My name is Edward Thornton. I own the Matias Ranch. He paused, and Ben could see him gathering himself for whatever came next, like a man preparing to lift something heavy. And those girls are my granddaughters. The words hit Ben like a fist. Your granddaughters. Thornton nodded slowly, each movement precise and controlled. Their mother was my daughter, Catherine. She died 3 years ago when the youngest was born. Ben's mind raced, trying to fit this new information into the picture he'd been forming. If Thornton was their grandfather, he had rights. Blood rights. Legal rights. The kind of rights that trumped good intentions and temporary custody and the desperate wishes of a dying father. Why didn't you take them in when their mother died? Thornton's face went tight with pain, real and raw enough that Ben knew it wasn't performance. James Harper wouldn't let me near them. He blamed me for Catherine's death. Said I worked her too hard on the ranch while she was carrying. He took the girls and disappeared. I've been looking for them ever since. Mrs. Hayes' hand fell away from Ben's arm. She looked between the two men with an expression Ben couldn't quite read, understanding dawning with all its complications and consequences. You want to take them? It wasn't a question, and Thornton didn't treat it like one. I want to give them a home, a real home with family, not some stranger who happened to find them by the roadside. The words stung, but Ben couldn't argue with them. He was a stranger. Thornton was family. The law would be clear about which one mattered more. I'd like to see them, please. Ben looked at Mrs. Hayes. She gave a small nod, neither approval nor disapproval, just acknowledgement that this was going to happen regardless of what any of them wanted. Ben knocked on the door. Grace, there's someone here who wants to meet you. The door opened. Grace stood there, Lily behind her, both of them with faces freshly washed and hair somewhat tidied. When Grace saw Thornton, something happened to her expression. It went very still, very careful, like a door closing and locking from the inside. Hello, Grace. Thornton's voice was soft, gentle in a way that seemed practiced, but not insincere. Do you remember me? Grace's hand found Lily's and gripped tight. Your grandfather, Thornton. That's right. Thornton took a step forward, and Ben saw Grace's body tense, every muscle coiling like she was preparing to run or fight or simply endure. I've been looking for you and your sister for a long time. Lily peeked around Grace, curious in the way that only small children could be, untouched yet by the wariness that came with understanding that the world held dangers. Are you our mama's papa? I am, sweetheart. Thornton's voice broke slightly, and Ben saw the shimmer of tears in the older man's eyes. You look just like her. Grace didn't move. Her body remained tense, coiled, And Ben saw it clearly now, saw what he'd missed before in the failing light by the river. This child was afraid, not of violence, not of immediate harm, but of something deeper and more insidious. Mr. Thornton would like to talk with you. Is that all right? Ben kept his voice careful, giving Grace the choice, even if it was only the illusion of choice. Grace looked up at Ben, and there was something in her eyes, a plea or a warning or both together, something that said, please don't leave me alone with him. Can you stay, of course? They sat in the small room, an awkward arrangement that spoke to all the broken connections and failed relationships that had led them to this moment. Thornton pulled up a chair. Mrs. Hayes brought stew and bread, and the girls ate while Thornton asked gentle questions, each one delivered with the careful precision of someone who understood he was navigating dangerous ground. Where had they been living? How was their father? Were they being treated well? Did they remember their mother? Grace answered carefully, revealing little, each word weighed and measured. Lily was more open, telling Thornton about the pretty flowers they'd seen by the river, about how Papa had sung them a song before he left, about a horse they'd once ridden at a farm where they'd stayed for a while. With each word, Ben watched Thornton's face. The man seemed genuinely moved, his hands trembling slightly when he lifted his coffee cup, his eyes wet when Lily mentioned the song. Whatever else he might be, his emotions seemed real. When the girls finished eating, Thornton stood, his movements stiff like someone who'd been sitting too long or carrying too much weight for too many years. I have a proposal. Let them stay here tonight. Tomorrow I'll come back and we can discuss their future properly. I want to do this right, legal and proper. Ben nodded slowly, though something in his gut twisted uncomfortably. That seems fair. Thornton moved toward the door, then stopped. He looked back at Grace, and his face carried an expression Ben recognized because he'd seen it in mirrors, in the faces of other men who'd lost things they couldn't get back. I loved your mother very much. And I love you, both of you. I know you don't remember me well, but I hope you'll give me a chance to be family again. Grace said nothing. The silence stretched out, filling the small room with everything that couldn't be spoken. All the history and hurt and hope tangled together like fishing line. Thornton left his footsteps heavy on the stairs, and when he was gone, Mrs. Hayes began clearing the dishes. Ben stood to help, but Grace's voice stopped him. Mr. Carter, can I talk to you alone? Ben looked at Mrs. Hayes. She nodded and took Lily with her to get the child ready for bed, leaving Ben and Grace in the small room with the lamplight flickering shadows on the walls. Grace moved to the window and stared out at the dark street. She stood very still, her back straight, shoulders tense, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. You can't let him take us. Ben moved closer. Grace, he's your grandfather. He has rights. Grace turned, and Ben saw tears on her face for the first time since he'd found them by the river. You don't understand. Papa didn't leave us because he was dying. What do you mean? Grace's voice dropped to a whisper, and Ben had to lean in to hear her. Grandfather Thornton found us 2 weeks ago. He came to our camp and told Papa he wanted us back. Papa said no. They fought. Grandfather said if Papa didn't hand us over, he'd use the law. He'd say Papa was unfit. He'd have Papa arrested for keeping us from family. Ben's chest tightened. What happened? Then Papa was scared. He's been sick, getting sicker. He knew he couldn't fight Grandfather in court, didn't have money for lawyers. So they made a deal. What kind of deal? Grace's tears came faster now, and her hands twisted in her dress. Papa would leave us somewhere public, somewhere we'd be found. Grandfather would wait a few days, then claim us legally. That way it would look like Papa abandoned us and Grandfather rescued us. Papa thought maybe if we were found by someone good first, that person might help us, might keep us away from Grandfather. Ben felt sick. Your father sold you to Thornton. Grace shook her head violently. Papa didn't want to, but Grandfather threatened him, said he'd have Papa put in jail, said we'd end up in an orphanage anyway if Papa didn't cooperate. At least this way, Grandfather said we'd be with family. Why don't you want to be with your grandfather? Ben knelt down so he was at eye level with her. Has he hurt you? No. Not like that. Grace wiped her face with the back of her hand. But Mama used to tell us stories about how Grandfather worked her so hard, how he cared more about his ranch than about people, how he wanted to control everything. Ben stood up, his mind racing through possibilities and finding no good options. Listen to me. I understand you're scared, but I'm nobody. I have no legal right to you. Thornton is your blood family. A court would give him custody in a heartbeat. Then don't let it go to court. Grace grabbed his hands, her small fingers wrapping around his with desperate strength. Please, Papa said someone good would come. He believed it. He left us at that river because he believed. Ben thought about the river, about how James Harper had chosen that specific spot, the same place where Daniel had died, the same crossing where Ben had been standing when he saw the girls. Chance. Or had James somehow known, somehow understood that grief and guilt could be turned into purpose if the right person came along? I can't promise anything. You already did. When you stopped, when you brought us here, you made a choice. Ben wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Because she was right. He had made a choice, had stopped running long enough to help, and now these children were counting on him in ways that terrified him more than any river current ever had. I'll figure something out, but I need time. How much time, I don't know. Grace's voice was flat, resigned. He doesn't have much patience, grandfather. He'll want us soon. Then we'll make some. Ben looked at this child who had already learned that the world didn't always offer good choices, only choices between bad and worse, and he made a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Let me talk to some people tomorrow, see what options there are, and if there aren't any options, then we'll make some. After Grace went to bed, Ben walked through the dark streets to the church. He hadn't been planning to go there tonight, had meant to wait until morning, when he'd had time to prepare himself to build up the armor he'd need to face the man he'd wronged. But something pulled him forward, some need to get the hardest thing over with, to face judgment, before he could think about helping anyone else. The church was dark except for a single lamp burning in the parsonage beside it. Ben knocked quietly and Ruth Mitchell answered. She was younger than her husband, maybe in her early 50s, with kind eyes that carried the weight of recent sorrow. When she saw Ben, her hand went to her heart. Mr. Carter, you came. Your letter said he was asking for me. Ruth stepped aside to let him in, and Ben followed her through the small house to a bedroom at the back. The room smelled of sickness and medicine, of a body slowly failing, despite all efforts to save it. Reverend Samuel Mitchell lay in the bed, his body thin under the quilts that covered him. His face was slack on one side, his right arm curled uselessly against his chest, but his left eye was open, clear aware. When that eye found Ben, something moved in the Reverend's expression, something that wasn't anger or accusation, but something softer, something Ben didn't have a name for. Samuel, Ruth said gently, Ben Carter is here. The Reverend's eye held Ben's, and Ben felt himself stripped bare. Under that gaze, all his defenses and excuses falling away like autumn leaves. Ben moved to the bedside. He had rehearsed what he would say during 15 months of running, had practiced the words until they'd lost all meaning. All the apologies and all the explanations, all the desperate pleas for forgiveness. But now, standing here with the Reverend looking at him with that knowing, patient eye, the words wouldn't come. All he could manage was the truth. I'm sorry, I tried to save him. I tried so hard. The Reverend's left hand moved slowly toward a slate board on the bedside table. Ruth handed it to him, along with a piece of chalk, and with painstaking care, each letter an effort, the Reverend wrote 2 words. I know. Ben's vision blurred. You know, the Reverend wrote again, the chalk scraping against slate, with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet room. He forgave you before he died. Something cracked inside Ben's chest, something he'd been holding together through sheer will for 15 months. The tears came then, unstoppable, and he collapsed into the chair beside the bed, his body shaking with sobs he'd been holding back for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to let them out. How do you know that? The Reverend's hand shook as he wrote the final message, each letter wobbly but clear. He told me, said the man tried, said be kind. Ben felt like he was drowning again, but this time the water was made of forgiveness. He didn't deserve mercy. He couldn't accept grace that burned like fire. Ruth's voice was soft when she spoke. When will you forgive yourself? Ben couldn't answer, didn't know how. The Reverend reached out with his left hand and gripped Ben's arm. The touch was weak but steady, intentional, telling Ben something that words, even written ones, couldn't fully convey. You have a chance now. Ruth spoke the words the Reverend couldn't. Those Harper girls need someone. My husband can't help them anymore. But you can. Ben wiped his face with the back of his hand. Their grandfather wants them. Ruth's voice hardened in a way that surprised Ben Steele, showing through the gentle exterior. Edward Thornton. That man cares about property, not people. If he wants those girls, it's because they're useful to him somehow. He says he loves them. Maybe he does. Ruth looked at her husband, and Ben saw decades of love and loss in that glance. But love isn't always enough. Sometimes love is selfish, and sometimes love is letting go. The Reverend's hand tightened on Ben's arm. His eye held Ben's with fierce intensity despite the ravaged body, and Ben understood what he couldn't say, what Ruth was translating into words. You want me to fight for them? The Reverend couldn't nod, couldn't speak, but the answer was in his eye, absolute and unwavering. I don't know how. I'm nobody. I have nothing. The Reverend released his arm and picked up the chalk again. He wrote 3 words slowly, deliberately, each one placed with the precision of someone who understood that words could change lives. You are here. Ben looked at those words for a long time, feeling their weight settle over him like a mantle. Present, not running, not hiding. It wasn't much, but maybe it was enough to start. He left the parsonage near midnight, walking through streets that had gone quiet and dark. The town slept around him, unaware that its most famous failure had returned, that decisions were being made in the darkness that would ripple out in ways no one could predict. Ben walked back toward the boarding house, his mind turning over everything that had happened. He was halfway there when a voice spoke from the shadows. Mr. Carter, a moment of your time. Ben turned. Edward Thornton stepped into the lamplight that spilled from the saloon across the street, and Ben saw that the older man's face looked tired, worn in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. Mr. Thornton, I wanted to speak with you away from the girls, man to man. All right. Thornton gestured to a bench outside the general store, and they sat, the night air cool around them, the distant sound of the piano still drifting from the saloon. I know what Grace told you. Thornton said it without preamble, and Ben kept his face neutral. What did she tell me? That her father and I had an arrangement, that I pressured James into giving up the girls. Thornton looked at Ben, and his eyes held the kind of honesty that was either truth or very skilled lying. Is that about right? Ben said nothing, and Thornton sighed, a sound that carried the weight of years and regret. It's true, all of it. I did threaten James. I did force his hand. He looked down at his hands, turning them over like he was seeing them for the first time. Does that make me a monster? That depends on why you did it. Thornton was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. My daughter died in my house, Mr. Carter. In my bed. She'd been working in the fields that day, pregnant and struggling, because I told her the ranch needed every hand. When her labor started, it was too fast, too violent. She bled to death before the doctor could get there. I'm sorry. James was right to blame me. I killed her with my greed, my ambition. Thornton's voice broke, and Ben saw tears on the older man's face. I've lived with that for 3 years, and those girls are all I have left of her. So you want them to ease your guilt? Thornton looked at him sharply. Is that so wrong? To want to make things right depends on what's right for them, not what's right for you, and you think you know what's right for them. Thornton's tone hardened. You're a drifter, a man who let a child die. You have nothing to offer those girls. I have time. I have attention. I have the willingness to put them first. For how long? Week, a month. Thornton leaned forward, and Ben could see the calculation behind the grief, the ruthlessness that had built an empire. I can give them a home, Mr. Carter. Education. A future. What can you give them? Ben had thought about Daniel, about the river, about 15 months of running from the one thing he should have faced. I can give them someone who stays, someone who doesn't walk away when it gets hard. Noble words, but words don't feed children, don't clothe them, don't protect them. Neither does guilt. Thornton stood, and Ben stood with him. They faced each other in the darkness, 2 men who understood that the coming conflict would be decided not by who was right, but by who the law favored. You're making a mistake, Carter. I'm their family. I have legal rights. You have nothing. Then I guess we'll see what the law says. Thornton's expression went cold in a way that made Ben understand how this man had built his empire, how he'd survived and thrived in country that killed the weak and the hesitant. One more thing. I know you went to see the Reverend tonight. I know he's dying, and I know he was the only person in this town who believed in you. When he's gone, you'll have no allies here, no one to speak for you. Ben felt the threat in those words, the promise of isolation and defeat. I don't need allies, I just need to do what's right. Thornton smiled, but there was no warmth in it. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, Mr. Carter. Let's hope yours don't lead those girls there. He walked away, disappearing into the darkness, and Ben stood alone in the empty street, feeling the weight of everything that had just been set in motion. He had made promises he didn't know if he could keep, had taken on a fight he didn't know if he could win. But as he looked up at the window where Grace and Lily slept, he knew he couldn't walk away. Not this time. The river had taken one child from him. He'd be damned if he let a broken system take two more. Ben walked back to the boarding house and knocked on Mrs. Hayes's door. She answered in her nightclothes, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her face set in the kind of patience that came from years of dealing with trouble at odd hours. I need a room. I'm staying in Millbrook. Mrs. Hayes studied his face for a long moment, reading things there that Ben hadn't meant to show. For how long? As long as it takes, she opened the door wider. I have a small room in the back. It's not much, it's enough. That night, Ben lay in a narrow bed in a town that had every reason to hate him, and he made himself a promise. He would fight for those girls. Not because it would redeem him, not because it would wash away his guilt, but because they deserved someone who would choose them, who would stay. And maybe in learning to protect them, he would finally learn to forgive himself. The ghosts we carry don't disappear. They walk beside us, reminding us of what we've lost, what we failed to save. But sometimes, if we're lucky, they also remind us that we still have chances, still have choices. Ben closed his eyes and saw Daniel's face one last time. Not drowning, not dying, but smiling the way he had before the river took him. And then Ben saw Grace's face, Lily's face, two children who needed him to be stronger than his past. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Thornton would make his move. The law would have its say. But tonight, Ben Carter was exactly where he needed to be. Present, not running, ready to fight. And sometimes that was all the redemption a broken man could hope for. Morning came to Millbrook with the kind of light that made everything look fragile, like the world was made of glass that might shatter if you breathed too hard. Ben stood at his window in the small room Mrs. Hayes had given him, watching the sun climb over the false-fronted buildings, painting long shadows across the dirt street below. He had not slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw faces. Daniel's face in the moment the light left his eyes. Grace's face when she'd asked him not to let Thornton take them. Lily's face so innocent and trusting, sleeping on her sister's lap by the river. The Reverend's face, one eye clear and knowing, writing those three words that had settled into Ben's bones like cold water. You are here. Ben dressed in his cleanest shirt and walked downstairs. The boarding house was already alive with the sounds of morning footsteps on the floors above, voices murmuring behind closed doors, the smell of coffee and bacon drifting from the kitchen, where Mrs. Hayes ruled with iron efficiency. He found her in the kitchen, flour dusting her hands as she kneaded bread, with the kind of violence that suggested she was working out more than just the dough. Coffee's on the stove. Help yourself. Ben poured a cup and stood by the window, looking out at the street, beginning to wake. A wagon rolled past the driver, hunched against the morning chill that would burn off by noon. A dog barked somewhere, the sound carrying in the clear air. Normal sounds of a normal day, except nothing about this day would be normal. The girl's still sleeping. For now, Mrs. Hayes punched the dough with more force than necessary. You know Thornton's going to move fast. He's not a patient man, I know. And you know you don't have a legal leg to stand on. Ben took a sip of coffee. It was strong and bitter, the way people made it when they needed the caffeine more than the taste. I know that too. Mrs. Hayes stopped kneading and looked at him, and her face held something that might have been concern, or might have been pity, or might have been both tangled together. So what's your plan? Find a way to prove I can provide for them. Find work, find a place to live. Show the court I'm capable. In how much time? Mrs. Hayes's voice was sharp but not unkind. Thornton will file papers today. You'll have a hearing within the week, maybe two if you're lucky. You think you can build a whole life in 2 weeks? Ben set his cup down, the china clicking against the saucer with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet kitchen. I have to try. Mrs. Hayes wiped her hands on her apron and came closer, her voice dropping to something that was almost gentle. Listen to me, Carter. I don't know what happened with the Reverend's boy. I don't know if you're a good man or a bad one trying to be better, but those girls upstairs trust you. I saw it in Grace's eyes last night. That kind of trust is rare and precious. Don't break it unless you're absolutely sure you can't keep it. I won't break it. Then you'd better be ready for war, because Thornton doesn't lose. Not in business, not in court, not in anything. Ben met her eyes and saw in them the hard-earned wisdom of someone who'd watched enough people try and fail to know the odds. Everyone loses eventually. Before Mrs. Hayes could respond, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Grace appeared holding Lily's hand. The younger girl's hair was a tangle of golden curls, her dress wrinkled from sleep, but Grace looked alert, watchful, as if she had not slept either, or had learned long ago that sleep was a luxury you couldn't always afford. "Good morning." Ben kept his voice gentle, the way you spoke to spooked horses or wild things that might bolt. Grace nodded, her eyes searching his face for something, some sign of what the new day would bring. "Is grandfather coming today?" "Probably." Grace's hand tightened on Lily's, the only outward sign of the fear Ben knew lived beneath her carefully maintained composure. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to find work. I'm going to talk to people who might help, and I'm going to make sure you're safe while I do it." Lily looked at Ben with those wine blue-wide eyes that still carried the kind of trust that made his chest ache. "Are you our papa now?" The question struck Ben in a place he'd thought long scarred over. He knelt down so he was at their level so they could see his face clearly and know he wasn't lying. "No, honey, I'm not your papa, but I'm someone who's going to look out for you." Like a friend, Lily's voice held such hope that Ben felt the weight of it settle over him like a physical thing. Ben glanced at Grace, whose face was carefully neutral, but he saw the hope hiding there, too fragile and desperate. "Yes, like a friend." Mrs. Hayes brought out breakfast eggs and toast and the bread she had been making, and the girls ate slowly, carefully, like children who had learned not to waste food because you never knew when the next meal might come. Ben watched them and felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper into his bones, felt it root there like something that would never leave. After breakfast, Ben walked to the general store. He needed information about who might be hiring, who might offer him a chance despite his reputation. Despite the story, everyone in Millbrook knew about the man who'd let the Reverend's son drown. The store was run by a man named Hewitt, thin and nervous, with the kind of face that always looked like it expected bad news. He looked at Ben like he might steal something, his eyes darting to the door as if planning an escape route. "I'm looking for work. Any kind. I can do ranch handwork, carpentry, hauling, anything honest." Hewitt shook his head before Ben finished speaking, the gesture automatic rehearsed. "Can't help you. Nobody's hiring right now." Ben knew it was a lie. He had seen help wanted signs in 3 windows on his way here, had heard talk of ranches needing hands for the summer season, of buildings needing repair after the hard winter. But arguing would not change anything, would only make Hewitt more nervous, more determined to get Ben out of his store. "If you hear of anything, I'm staying at Mrs. Hayes's boarding house." Hewitt turned back to his inventory without answering, and Ben left the door closing behind him with a sound like finality. He tried the livery stable next, where an old man named Cole looked at him with weathered eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. "Come back another time, son." But those eyes said what the words didn't. "Don't come back at all." The blacksmith shop was run by a young man named Marcus Strong, and capable but timid in the way of people who'd learned that speaking up brought trouble. He glanced nervously out the window while Ben explained what he needed, like Edward Thornton might be watching, cataloging who helped the stranger and who knew better. "We'll keep you in mind." The words were empty, a polite fiction that fooled no one. By the time Ben reached the freight company, he understood what was happening. The manager didn't even let him finish, just shook his head and closed the door, and Ben stood there on the wooden sidewalk, feeling the trap close around him with mechanical precision. At the saloon, the bartender at least had the honesty to speak the truth. "Thornton owns half this town, friend. Nobody crosses him." By noon, Ben stood in the middle of Main Street, sun beating down, dust swirling around his boots, and felt the impossibility of what he'd promised settle over him like a weight. Edward Thornton had already spread the word. No one would hire the man who wanted to keep Thornton's granddaughters from him. Without work, he could not prove he could provide for the girls. Without that proof, he would lose them in court. The future unfolded in his mind with terrible clarity. Grace and Lily in the big house at the Thornton Ranch, well-fed and well-clothed and well-educated, but not loved. Not really, just owned like property, like pieces on a chessboard, like redemption for sins that could never truly be redeemed. Ben leaned against a post, removed his hat, wiped sweat from his forehead. For a moment, just a moment, he considered walking away, getting on his horse and riding back into the anonymity of drifting where no one expected anything from him and failure was just another day. "Mr. Carter," The voice came from behind him, and Ben turned to see a woman standing in the shade of the general store awning. She was in her late 20s with dark hair, pulled back in a severe bun, though a few strands had escaped to soften the look. Wire-rimmed spectacles perched on a sharp nose, and her gray dress had been mended multiple times, with the kind of skilled needlework that spoke of necessity meeting pride. "I'm Emma Reed, the new school teacher." Ben removed his hat properly, the gesture automatic from years of his mother's training. "Ma'am." Emma studied him with cool gray eyes that seemed to catalog and assess in the space of a heartbeat. There was something familiar in the way she held herself, something Ben recognized because he saw it in mirrors, that particular tension of someone always ready to run. "I heard you're looking for work. Word travels fast. It's a small town, Mr. Carter." She paused, and Ben saw calculation happening behind those sharp eyes. "I also heard you're trying to care for the Harper girls." "That's right." Emma's expression didn't change, but something flickered there too quick to name. Why the question caught Ben off guard. "Because they need help. There's an orphanage in Omaha. They could go there. They could, but they shouldn't have to." Emma's face remained neutral, but Ben saw it now. Saw what lived beneath the careful composure. Approval, maybe? Or recognition of something she understood from her own experience. The church needs a groundskeeper, someone to maintain the building, tend the cemetery, chop wood, do repairs. Reverend Mitchell used to do it himself, but now... She trailed off, and Ben heard all the things she didn't say, all the knowledge of death approaching and duties left undone. "The position pays $25 a month. There's a small room in the back of the church where you could stay." Ben felt hope flicker in his chest, fragile as candlelight in wind. "Why are you offering this?" "Because Mrs. Mitchell asked me to. She said her husband would have wanted it." Emma's voice softened slightly, and Ben saw past the severe exterior to something underneath, something that knew what it meant to need help and not receive it. "And because those girls deserve someone who fights for them." "I'll take it. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. The work is hard and the pay is poor. And people will talk about you working at the church where..." She stopped herself, but Ben heard the rest of it hanging in the air between them. "Where the Reverend's son died. Let them talk." Emma nodded once, sharp and final, the gesture of someone who'd learned to make decisions quickly and not look back. "You start tomorrow morning. Be here at dawn." She turned to go back into the church, but Ben's voice stopped her. "Miss Reed, why are you really helping me?" Emma looked back over her shoulder, and for just a moment, Ben saw something raw and honest cross her face. "Because sometimes strangers are kinder than family, Mr. Carter. I've learned that lesson the hard way." Then she was gone, leaving Ben standing in the street with the first piece of hope he'd felt since arriving in Millbrook. It wasn't much, $25 a month and a room in a church, but it was income proof of stability, evidence that he was more than just a drifter passing through. Ben went back to the boarding house and found Grace and Lily in the small parlor. Grace was reading to her sister from a worn book, her voice steady and clear, and Lily listened with rapt attention, occasionally interrupting to ask questions about words or meanings or why characters did the things they did. When Grace saw Ben, she stopped reading. "Did you find work?" "I did, at the church. I'll be the groundskeeper." Grace's shoulders relaxed slightly, a tension easing that Ben hadn't fully noticed until it was gone. "That's good." Lily bounced up, her natural exuberance breaking through the careful quiet both girls maintained. "Can we visit you there?" Ben smiled, and it felt strange on his face, like a muscle he'd forgotten how to use. "I think that can be arranged." That afternoon, Edward Thornton came. Ben heard the knock and opened the door himself, and Thornton stood on the porch dressed in a fine suit hat, it in hand, the picture of respectability and power and everything Ben was not. "Mr. Carter, I'd like to speak with my granddaughters if you don't mind." Ben did mind, but he had no legal right to refuse. "The girls are in the parlor. I'll be staying with them." Thornton's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Of course. They sat in the cramped parlor, an awkward arrangement of adults and children, trying to navigate impossible terrain. Thornton had brought gifts, a rag doll for Lily and a book for Grace, both wrapped carefully in brown paper and string. The girls accepted them with quiet thank yous, but Grace's posture remained stiff, guarded her body language, screaming caution even as her words remained polite. "I want to talk to you about your future." Thornton's voice was gentle, carefully modulated to convey care and concern. "I have a beautiful home, plenty of room for both of you. Good food, warm beds. I could hire a tutor to make sure you get proper schooling. Lily looked interested, her natural curiosity breaking through her sister's careful wariness. Do you have horses? Thornton's face softened in a way that seemed genuine grief and love, mixing in an expression Ben recognized because he'd worn it himself. Dozens of them. Your mother used to love the horses. She had a favorite, a gray mare named Silver. She's still there, getting old now, but gentle as can be. Grace said nothing, her silence more eloquent than any words could have been. Thornton looked at her, and Ben saw him working to find the right approach, the right words to break through her defenses. I know you're scared. I know your father told you things about me, and some of them might even be true. But I've changed, Grace. Losing your mother taught me what matters, and what matters is family. Grace's voice was quiet when she finally spoke, but it cut through the room like a knife. We have family. We have Mr. Carter. Thornton's face hardened for just a moment before smoothing out again, but Ben saw it, saw the flash of something that might have been anger or frustration or simple calculation. Mr. Carter is a kind man who helped you, but he's not family. He's not blood. Grace looked up at Ben, and he saw her drawing strength from his presence, saw her preparing to fight in the only way an 8-year-old could. Mama used to say blood doesn't make family. Love does. Your mother was wise. Thornton leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees. But she also understood that children need stability, security, things I can provide that Mr. Carter cannot. Ben wanted to interrupt, to argue, but he forced himself to stay silent. This was between Thornton and the girls, and anything Ben said would only make it worse, would only prove Thornton's point that he was an outsider trying to interfere in family business. I'll be filing papers with the territorial court tomorrow. There will be a hearing in about 2 weeks. The judge will decide what's best for you. Grace's hands twisted in her dress, the only outward sign of the fear Ben knew was flooding through her. What if we tell the judge we want to stay with Mr. Carter? Thornton's smile was sad, and Ben couldn't tell if it was genuine or practiced to perfection. Then the judge will consider that, but she'll also consider what's practical, what's legal. And legally, I'm your closest living relative. After Thornton left, Grace sat very still on the sofa, the book he had given her unopened in her lap. Lily played with her new doll, oblivious to the tension crackling through the room like electricity before a storm. Ben sat beside Grace. You all right? Grace shook her head, and the honesty of it hit Ben harder than any lie would have. He's going to win, isn't he? I don't know. Yes, you do. Grace looked at him with those eyes that had seen too much, understood too much. He has more money, more power, more everything. What do you have? Ben thought about lying, about offering false hope, but he respected her too much for that. She deserved the truth even when the truth was bitter. I have time to give you, attention, the willingness to listen. That's not enough. Grace whispered it, and the words hung in the air between them like an indictment. Not in court. Ben wished he could tell her she was wrong, but he had a terrible feeling she was right. Courts dealt in evidence and law, not in the intangible things that made a home that turned strangers into family. That evening, Ben moved his few belongings to the small room behind the church. It was barely larger than a closet with a narrow cot, a washstand, and a single window that looked out onto the cemetery. But it was his, and it came with honest work, and that was more than he'd had in 15 months. Ruth Mitchell met him there with fresh linens and a lamp, her face drawn with exhaustion and grief, but her eyes still kind. Thank you for taking this on. Samuel would be glad to know you're here. How is he today? The same. She folded the linens on the cot with precise, careful movements, each fold exact, as if imposing order on fabric could somehow impose order on a world that had become chaotic and painful. The doctor says it could be days or weeks. There's no way to know. I'm sorry. Don't be. We've had 30 good years together. That's more than many people get. She paused, her hands stilling on the linens. What you're doing for those girls, it's what Samuel would have wanted. He believed in second chances. Ben looked out the window at the rows of graves, at the monuments to lives lived and ended, at the permanence of death carved in stone. Even for someone like me, especially for someone like you, the ones who know they're broken are the ones most likely to heal. After she left, Ben stood in his small room and let the silence settle around him. He could see Daniel's grave from his window, the small headstone with its carved lamb, fresh flowers at the base, that Ruth tended with the devotion of someone who refused to let grief win completely. Ben had been running from that grave for 15 months, had crossed states and territories to avoid it, had worked meaningless arms and drunk cheap whiskey, and done everything he could to not think about the small body in the ground and what it represented. Now he would see it every day, would wake to it every morning and fall asleep to it every night, an unavoidable reminder of his greatest failure. The thought should have terrified him, should have made him want to run again. Instead, he felt something close to peace. Maybe facing fears wasn't about conquering them. Maybe it was about learning to live beside them, to carry them without being crushed. The next morning, Ben woke before dawn and began his work. The church needed everything. Loose shingles that had let in rain all winter, weeds that had overtaken the foundation, a cemetery fence broken in places where cattle had pushed through firewood that needed chopping and stacking for the coming winter. Ben threw himself into the labor with an intensity that surprised him. Every nail he hammered felt like a small act of penance. Every weed he pulled felt like clearing space for something new to grow. The work was hard and honest, and his hands, soft from months of drifting, grew calloused again. He was working in the cemetery repairing a section of fence when he heard footsteps. He looked up to see Emma approaching with a basket covered by a cloth. "Mrs. Mitchell asked me to bring you lunch." She set the basket on a nearby headstone, and Ben expected her to leave, but she stood watching him work, her expression thoughtful. "You're good at this. I've done a lot of fence work. That's not what I meant." Emma gestured at the cemetery, at the way Ben moved among the graves with something that looked like reverence. "You're not afraid to be here." Most people are uncomfortable in cemeteries. They avoid looking at the graves, hurry through when they have to visit. But you look at them like you're paying respect. Ben drove another nail home, the sounds sharp in the quiet air. "I have reason to." Emma was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice held no judgment, just a statement of fact. "Daniel Mitchell," Ben's hand stilled. "You know about that." "Everyone knows about that, Mr. Carter. It's a small town." Emma paused, and Ben could feel her choosing her words carefully. "They say you tried to save him." "I failed. You tried. That's what Mrs. Mitchell had told me. She said you nearly drowned trying to pull him out." "Nearly doesn't count." Emma stepped closer, and her voice was soft but firm, carrying the weight of someone who understood failure from the inside. "I knew a girl in Boston, 12 years old. Her father beat her mother every night. One night the girl tried to stop him, stood between them with a kitchen knife and told him to leave. He left, but 2 days later he came back with a gun and shot them both. The mother died. The girl survived." Ben looked at her, saw past the spectacles and severe hair and careful composure to the scars underneath. "That girl was you." Emma's face didn't change, but she didn't deny it either. "The point is, Mr. Carter, sometimes we try to save people and fail. That doesn't make the trying worthless. My father went to prison, hanged 6 months later. The court called it justice. I call it too late. I'm sorry. Don't be. I'm only telling you so you understand that I know what failure feels like. I know what it means to carry someone's death with you." She met his eyes, and Ben saw strength there, the kind forged in fire and pain. "But I also know that we can't let the dead define us. We have to live for the living." Ben thought about Grace and Lily, about the living who needed him now, and felt Emma's words settle into the places where guilt lived. "Thank you." Emma adjusted her spectacles, a nervous gesture that seemed out of place on someone so composed. "Eat lunch before it gets cold." She turned to leave, but Ben's voice stopped her. "Miss Reed, you're in some kind of trouble, aren't you?" Emma stiffened, her back going rigid. "Why would you ask that?" "Because you flinch when wagons come down the street. Because you watch the road like you're expecting someone. Because you're in a town like Millbrook when someone with your education could be teaching in Omaha or Denver." Emma's hands clenched in her skirts, and for a moment Ben thought she might deny. It might retreat behind the walls of propriety and privacy. But something in her face shifted, and he saw the truth there, raw and frightened. "I should go. If you need help, I'm offering. You can barely help yourself, Mr. Carter." "How could you possibly help me? I don't know, but the offer stands." Emma looked at him for a long moment, and Ben saw her weighing trust against fear, saw the calculation of someone who'd learned the hard way, that accepting help often came with a price. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I'll remember that." Then she walked away, her back straight and her steps measured. But Ben saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she glanced back once before disappearing around the church. Days passed, and Ben fell into a rhythm. Work at the church from dawn until mid-afternoon, visit with Grace and Lily for a few hours, then more work until dark. The labor was hard but satisfying, the kind that let him sleep without dreams for the first time in months. Grace and Lily came to see him every day. Grace would read while Ben worked, her voice carrying across the cemetery steady and clear. Lily would pick wildflowers and place them on graves, especially the ones that looked neglected, singing little songs to herself as she worked. One afternoon, while Ben was replacing broken boards on the church steps, Lily asked him a question that made him pause mid-swing. "Mister, Ben, do dead people get lonely?" Ben set down his hammer and considered how to answer a child's question about death without lying or frightening her. "I don't think so, honey. I think they have each other. Even the ones with no family, especially those ones. I think they make new family like we're doing." Lily seemed satisfied with this answer and went back to her flowers, but Grace looked up from her book, her eyes sharp and questioning. "Do you really believe that Ben hammered in another nail, buying time to think?" "I want to believe it. That's not the same thing." "No, it's not." Grace closed her book. "Papa used to say wanting something doesn't make it real. Your papa was right. But sometimes wanting something is the first step to making it real." Grace thought about this, her young face serious. "Is that what you're doing? Making us into family because you want a—" Ben set down his hammer and looked at her, this child who asked questions that cut to the heart of things. "I'm trying. I don't know if it'll work. But I'm trying. That's what Papa said too before he left." The words stung and Ben didn't look away from the pain they brought. "I'm not your Papa, Grace, and I can't promise I won't fail you. But I can promise I won't stop trying." Grace's eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. That's more than most people promise. That evening, as Ben was locking up the church, Emma appeared again. This time she looked different. Her hair was down loose around her shoulders in a way that made her look younger and more vulnerable. Her face was pale and there was a bruise on her wrist that she tried to hide beneath her sleeve. Ben saw it anyway. "What happened?" Emma pulled her sleeve down further. "Nothing. I fell. Don't lie to me." Emma's face crumpled, and then she straightened, fighting for composure with visible effort. "I need your help. Just for tonight, maybe a few nights. I can't." Her voice broke. "I can't go back to the boarding house." Ben didn't hesitate. "You can stay in the church. There's a small room upstairs where we store hymnals. It has a cot. People will talk. Let them." Emma's voice rose desperate now. "If people see me staying here with you, it will ruin any chance you have of keeping the girls. Thornton will use it against you. Then we'll be careful. But I'm not leaving you to whatever put that bruise on your wrist." Emma sat down hard on the church steps, her whole body shaking. "He found me. I thought I had more time, but he found me." "Who found you?" Emma's voice was hollow when she answered, emptied of everything but truth. "My husband." The words hit Ben like a fist. "You're married legally." "Yes, his name is Robert Hendricks. We were married in Boston 2 years ago. It was arranged by our families. My father owed his father money. The marriage settled the debt." Ben sat beside her on the steps. "And he hurt you. Every day." Emma's tears came now quiet and unstoppable, years of holding them back finally breaking through. "He said it was his right that a wife should obey. When I ran 6 months ago, I thought I could disappear. But he hired men to find me, and now he's here." "Where is he now?" "At the hotel. He came to see me today, told me I have until tomorrow to pack my things. Then we're going back to Boston." She looked at Ben with eyes that held nothing but despair. "If I refuse, he'll have me arrested. A wife who abandons her husband can be charged with desertion. I'll go to jail or an asylum. There has to be a way." "There isn't. The law is on his side." Emma wiped her face with the back of her hand. "I shouldn't have come here. I shouldn't have involved you. You have enough problems." Ben stood and held out his hand. "Come with me." He led her into the church and up the narrow stairs to the storage room. It was dusty and cramped, filled with boxes of hymnals and old vestments, but there was a cot shoved against one wall and a window that looked out over the town. He lit a lamp. "You stay here tonight. Tomorrow we figure out what to do. There's nothing to do." "Unless—" Emma stopped and Ben heard hope and fear warring in that silence. "Unless what?" "Unless I can prove the marriage was invalid, that he coerced me, that there were grounds for annulment, but that would require a lawyer money time I don't have. What if you remarried?" Emma looked at him strangely. Bigamy is illegal, Mr. Carter. I can't marry someone else while still married to Robert. But if the first marriage was annulled, then yes. If you married someone else, Robert would have no claim. But we just established that annulment is impossible. Ben paced the small room, his mind turning over possibilities, each one more desperate than the last. What if you didn't annul it? What if you married me anyway? Emma stared at him like he'd lost his mind. That's insane, is it? If you're married to me even illegally, it complicates things for Hendricks. Gives you protection while you fight for annulment, and ruins your custody case. Emma's voice was sharp. The moment Thornton finds out you married a woman who's already married, he'll use it to paint you as morally corrupt. You'll lose Grace and Lily, maybe. Or maybe it shows I'm willing to build a stable home. Shows I have a partner to help raise them. This is madness. Ben sat beside her on the cot. Miss Reed, you helped me when no one else would. You gave me work when this whole town turned its back. Let me return the favor. By destroying both our lives, by giving us both a fighting chance. Emma was quiet for a long time, and Ben could see her, working through it, weighing options that all seemed equally terrible. Why would you do this? You barely know me. Ben thought about Daniel, about the river, about 15 months of running from the one thing he should have faced. Because someone has to stop running. Someone has to stand and fight. Emma looked at him with those gray eyes, searching his face for truth or deception or hope. If we do this, it has to be real. Not just on paper. We'd have to make people believe it. I know. And you'd be tied to me, to my problems, to the danger Robert represents. I know that too. Emma stood and moved to the window, looking out at the dark cemetery, at the monuments to the dead and the living who tended them. I never wanted to marry for convenience. I did that once. It nearly killed me. This is different. This is choosing for ourselves. Emma turned. Is it? Or are we just two desperate people making a terrible mistake? Ben had no answer for that, only the certainty that doing nothing would be worse. He stood and held out his hand. Maybe we are. Or maybe we're two people who see each other clearly enough to know we're both worth saving. Emma looked at his hand for a long moment, and Ben could see the war happening behind her eyes, fear and hope and desperation all tangled together. Then she took his hand, and her fingers were cold, but her grip was firm. God help us both. He will or he won't. Either way, we face it together. They stood there in the lamplight, two broken people making impossible promises, and something shifted in the air between them. Not love, not yet, but something that might grow into it, given time and courage and the willingness to stay when every instinct screamed, run. The next morning, Ben woke to find Emma gone. For a moment, he feared she had left town, had decided to run again rather than face what was coming. Then he saw the note on the cot, written in careful script. Gone to confront Robert. If I don't return by noon, it means he's taking me back to Boston. Thank you for trying. Ben dressed in seconds and ran to the hotel. He found Emma in the lobby, standing very still, while a man in an expensive suit gripped her arm. The man was handsome in a cold way, with pale eyes and a smile that never reached them, and Ben knew without being told that this was Robert Hendricks. Darling, don't make a scene. We're leaving this afternoon, and that's final. Let go of her. Ben's voice was quiet, but it carried across the lobby, and several people turned to watch. Robert turned, his expression shifting from annoyance to amusement. And who are you? Someone who's asking you politely to release the lady. Robert laughed, the sound cultured and dismissive. The lady, this is my wife, friend. I suggest you move along before you embarrass yourself. Ben stepped closer, and he felt something old and familiar rising in him. Something from his army days that knew how to face violence with calm certainty. I suggest you take your hands off her before I remove them for you. Robert's smile vanished. His grip on Emma tightened, and Ben saw her wince. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A man who beats women because it makes him feel strong. Robert's face flushed red. He released Emma and stepped toward Ben, and for a moment the lobby crackled with the promise of violence. You dare speak to me like that? Before Ben could respond, Emma spoke, her voice steady and clear, despite the fear Ben could see in her eyes. You won't have me arrested, Robert, because I'm going to tell the sheriff exactly what you did to me in Boston. I'm going to show him the scars, and I'm going to press charges for assault. Robert turned on her, and the mask slipped, showing the ugliness underneath. You wouldn't dare. Your reputation would be ruined. My reputation is already ruined. You saw to that, but yours isn't yet. Emma's voice gained strength with each word. How would it look if word got back to Boston that you beat your wife, that she ran away, and you chased her across the country like a dog? That's slander. It's truth, and I have witnesses. Emma gestured to the people gathered in the lobby, watching with the avid interest of small-town gossips who'd just been handed gold. You have a choice, Robert. Leave now quietly, and we both walk away. Or stay and fight and watch your precious reputation crumble. Robert looked between them, calculation replacing rage in his pale eyes. Then he smiled, slow and cruel. You think you've won, but you're still my wife, Emma. Legally bound to me. I have resources you can't imagine. I'll come back with lawyers. I'll drag you through every court from here to the Atlantic. He turned and walked toward the stairs, and at the bottom he looked back. Enjoy your little victory. It won't last. After he was gone, Emma's legs gave out. Ben caught her, helped her to a chair in the lobby, while curious eyes watched and tongues prepared to wag. Did I just make everything worse? No, you stood up to him. That's not making it worse. But he'll come back. He meant what he said about the lawyers. Ben knelt beside her chair. Then we get married today. Make it harder for him to claim you. You're serious, dead serious. But what about Grace and Lily? What about your custody case? We'll figure it out. But first we protect you. Emma's eyes filled with tears. I don't deserve this kindness. Neither did I. But Reverend Mitchell gave it to me anyway. Ben stood and held out his hand. What do you say? Miss Reed want to marry a broken-down groundskeeper with more problems than prospects. Despite everything, Emma laughed, a small sound fragile as glass. You certainly know how to sweep a woman off her feet. Mr. Carter, is that a yes? Ahmad took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. It's a yes. God forgive us both. They were married that afternoon in a church in the next town over, with only Mrs. Hayes and Ruth Mitchell as witnesses. The Reverend could not perform the ceremony, so they found a justice of the peace who asked no questions and seemed to sense that questions would not be welcomed. Ben signed his name. Emma signed hers. And just like that, they were bound together, two strangers trying to save each other from drowning in different rivers. When they returned to Millbrook, news of the marriage had already spread, traveling on that mysterious network of gossip that moved faster than horses. Ben saw it in the faces of people they passed, shock and disapproval and speculation, and then he saw Edward Thornton standing outside his hotel watching them ride past. The older man's face was unreadable, but his eyes held something cold and calculating, and Ben knew what this meant. Thornton would move faster now, would use the marriage as proof that Ben was unstable, impulsive, unfit to raise children. The custody hearing was in 1 week. Ben had just made it much easier for Thornton to win. That night, Ben sat with Grace and Lily in Mrs. Hayes's parlor. He had to tell them about the marriage before they heard it from someone else, had to try to explain something he barely understood himself. Grace listened in silence. Lily asked if this meant Emma would be their mama. Not exactly, but she'll be family. Grace stood abruptly. I need to talk to you alone. They went out onto the porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood, and Grace stood with her back to him, her small shoulders rigid. You married her to save her, not for us. Ben started to deny it, then stopped. She deserved truth, not comfort. You're right, I did. So what happens to us? What happens when grandfather's lawyer asks you in court why you married a stranger? What will you say? I'll tell the truth. The truth will lose us. Grace turned and tears streamed down her face. I thought you understood. I thought you were different. Ben moved to stand beside her. Grace, look at me. She did reluctantly, and Ben saw the betrayal in her eyes. I'm not your papa. I'm not gonna lie to you and say everything will be fine. But I need you to understand something. His voice was gentle but firm. Emma needed help. She was in danger. I couldn't walk away from that, even if it means losing us. The question hung in the air between them like an accusation. Ben took a breath and let it out slowly. I don't know how to make you understand this, but 15 months ago when Daniel died, I froze. I tried to save him, but when it mattered most, I wasn't fast enough, wasn't strong enough. I've carried that every day since. Grace's face softened slightly. When Emma needed help, I had a choice. Save myself by walking away, or try to save her and risk everything. And I couldn't walk away. Not again. Not when I had the chance to do it right this time. But we're not, Daniel. We're right here. We're not drowning. No, but you're not safe either. And I won't sacrifice someone else's safety to improve my chances in court. Grace was quiet for a long time, and Ben could see her working through it, trying to understand adult choices with a child's understanding of fairness. Papa said the same thing. He said he was doing what was right, and then he left us under a tree. The comparison hit Ben hard because it was fair, because he had no good answer for it. Your papa made a terrible choice, and maybe I'm making one too. But the difference is, I'm telling you the truth. I'm not pretending this is for your own good. I'm saying I made a choice that might cost us everything, and I'm asking you to understand why. Grace looked at him with tears streaming down her face. I don't want to understand. I want someone who chooses us, just us, nobody else. Ben pulled her into a hug and she resisted for a moment, then collapsed against him, sobbing in a way he suspected she hadn't let herself do in front of her sister, in front of anyone. I know. I know you do. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. They stood there on the porch as darkness fell, a man and a child both carrying more weight than they should have to bear, and Ben wondered if doing the right thing ever stopped feeling like failure. The night before the hearing, Ben could not sleep. He lay on the narrow cot in his small room behind the church, staring at the ceiling, while his mind turned over impossible choices and unlikely outcomes. Through the window, he could see the cemetery bathed in moonlight rows of headstones, casting long shadows across grass that looked silver in the pale light. Somewhere in that darkness was Daniel's grave, the boy who had forgiven him before dying, the boy whose death had sent Ben running for 15 months. And now Ben was about to face another kind of death, the death of hope, maybe the death of the fragile family he had tried to build from broken pieces and desperate choices. In the morning, Judge Eleanor Hartwell would decide everything. Whether Grace and Lily would go to Edward Thornton's ranch, whether Emma would be forced back to Boston, and the husband who had beaten her, whether Ben's choices had saved anyone or simply destroyed them all more slowly. He rose before dawn and dressed in the dark, his hands shaking as he buttoned the shirt Ruth Mitchell had pressed for him, the same shirt that had belonged to Reverend Samuel. The Reverend had died 3 days ago, 11 days after Ben's return to Millbrook, slipping away in his sleep with Ruth holding his hand, and Ben had stood by the graveside feeling like he'd lost the only person who'd believed he was worth saving. Ben walked out into the cemetery as the first gray light touched the eastern sky. His feet carried him without conscious thought to Daniel's grave, to the small headstone with its carved lamb that looked peaceful in the pre-dawn stillness. He knelt in the wet grass. I don't know what to do. His voice was quiet, spoken to stone and earth and whatever lay beyond. The hearing is today. I might lose them, probably will lose them, and it's my fault for making the choices I made. The wind moved through the grass, carrying the scent of earth and growing things, and Ben felt the familiar weight of failure pressing down on his shoulders. I married Emma to save her, and I know that's going to cost me Grace and Lily. Thornton's lawyers will paint me as reckless, unstable. They'll say I care more about a stranger than about the girls I'm supposed to be fighting for. He touched the carved lamb with gentle fingers. But here's what I can't explain to anyone. If I had walked away from Emma to improve my chances in court, I would have become the kind of man who doesn't deserve those girls anyway. He paused, and the silence felt like listening. Does that make sense? Am I just justifying my own failure? The sky was lightening now, stars fading into blue, and Ben felt the weight of the day ahead settling over him like a physical thing. Your father forgave me, your mother forgave me, but I still see your face every night, still feel your weight in my arms when the current pulled us under. And I think maybe I'm not supposed to forget. Maybe I'm supposed to carry you with me, not as punishment, but as reminder. He stood slowly, his knees protesting. Reminder of what it costs to fail. Reminder that trying isn't always enough, but also reminder that trying matters, that showing up matters, that being present when it's easier to run, that's the only kind of courage some of us ever get. Ben looked at the grave for a long moment. I'm going to lose today. I know that. But I'm going to stand there and fight anyway for Grace, for Lily, for Emma, for everyone who needs someone to stand when standing seems pointless. He turned to leave, then looked back one final time. Thank you for forgiving me, even if I never quite forgive myself. The sun broke over the horizon as Ben walked back to the church. Golden lights spilling across the cemetery, touching each stone, each name, each story of a life lived and ended. Ben felt the weight of all those endings, but he also felt something else, something that had been growing quietly in the weeks since he stopped running. Not peace exactly, but acceptance. The understanding that some things could not be fixed, only carried, and that carrying them with intention was its own kind of redemption. At the boarding house, Emma was helping Grace and Lily dress. Mrs. Hayes had found clean dresses for both girls, mended and pressed with the kind of care that spoke of someone who understood that dignity mattered, especially when facing judgment. Grace stood very still while Emma braided her hair, her face pale and set. Lily chattered nervously, asking questions nobody could answer. Will the judge be nice? Will we get to talk? What if grandfather cries? Emma answered with patience. Ben could not have managed her own hands steady, despite the terror he knew she must be feeling. Today would decide her fate as much as the girls. Robert Hendricks was in town waiting, his lawyers having filed motions that challenged the legality of Ben and Emma's marriage. If their union was ruled invalid, if Emma was ordered back to Boston, there would be nothing Ben could do to stop it. They gathered in Mrs. Hayes' parlor, a strange assembly of hope and desperation. Ben in the reverend suit, Emma in a simple gray dress that made her look older and more severe. Grace in blue calico, with her hair braided tight, Lily in yellow gingham with her golden curls brushed until they shone. A family assembled from spare parts and desperate choices. Mrs. Hayes looked at them with something like pride in her weathered face. You look respectable. That's half the battle. The other half is the truth. Sometimes the truth isn't enough, but it's all we've got. They walked to the courthouse together, and the whole town seemed to be watching. People lined the street, whispering behind hands, pointing, and Ben kept his eyes forward, his hand steady on Grace's shoulder. Edward Thornton was already there, standing on the courthouse steps with his lawyers, 3 men in expensive suits carrying leather cases full of documents and precedents. They looked at Ben's small group with barely concealed contempt. Thornton himself looked different than Ben had seen him before, older and tired, his face drawn with something that might have been grief or resignation or both. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding that today would change everything for both of them, regardless of who won. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with townspeople who had come to watch the spectacle. Ben saw familiar faces. Dr. Kensington, the sheriff's store owners, who had refused to hire him, ranch hands who had turned him away. They had all come to witness justice or judgment or whatever passed for truth in a small-town court. Judge Eleanor Hartwell entered, and the room fell silent. She was a woman in her late 40s with iron gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She had been a lawyer before becoming a judge, one of the few women to break into that profession, and her reputation for fairness was matched only by her reputation for severity. She took her seat and surveyed the courtroom with those sharp eyes. This is a custody hearing regarding Grace Harper, age 8, and Lily Harper, age 5. Mr. Edward Thornton has petitioned for guardianship as the children's maternal grandfather. Mr. Ben Carter currently has temporary custody and is contesting the petition. Judge Hartwell looked at both parties. Before we begin, I want to make something clear. This court cares about one thing and one thing only. What is in the best interest of these children? Not what's convenient, not what's traditional. What's best? She nodded to Thornton's lead lawyer. Mr. Preston, you may present your case. Preston stood tall and confident, a man who knew the law and how to use it like a weapon. Your Honor, the facts of this case are simple. Mr. Thornton is the children's grandfather. He has a substantial estate, the means to provide excellent care, and the legal right as their closest living relative. He outlined Thornton's case with practiced efficiency. The ranch, the stable income, the tutors Thornton would hire, the life of comfort and security he could offer. Each point was delivered with the calm certainty of someone who knew which side the law favored. Mr. Carter, on the other hand, is a drifter with a questionable past. He was present when a child drowned 15 months ago. He has no permanent residence beyond a room in a church. His income is $25 a month. Preston paused, letting the meager sum hang in the air. And 3 days ago, he married a woman who is already legally married to another man. The words dropped into the courtroom like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and whispered commentary through the assembled crowd. That's right, Your Honor. Mr. Carter's marriage to Miss Reed is invalid because she is still married to Mr. Robert Hendricks of Boston. This shows not only poor judgment, but a blatant disregard for the law. Judge Hartwell's expression did not change. Is Mr. Hendricks present? He is, Your Honor. Preston gestured and Robert Hendricks stood from the gallery. He looked every inch the wronged husband, dignified and sorrowful and respectable, playing his part with the skill of someone who understood that appearance mattered more than truth. Judge Hartwell studied him for a moment. We'll address that matter separately. Continue, Mr. Preston. Preston presented documents, financial statements showing Thornton's wealth letters from prominent citizens vouching for his character, medical reports on the girls showing they were malnourished and neglected when found. Each piece of evidence was another nail in Ben's coffin, another proof that law and logic would favor wealth and blood over good intentions and borrowed hope. When Preston finished, Judge Hartwell turned to Ben. Mr. Carter, do you have legal representation? Ben stood feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom. No, Your Honor, I'm representing myself. A murmur ran through the crowd and Judge Hartwell's eyes narrowed slightly. You understand you're at a significant disadvantage. I understand, Your Honor, but I couldn't afford a lawyer, and I believe the truth speaks for itself. Very well, present your case. Ben had no documents, no character witnesses beyond Mrs. Hayes and Ruth Mitchell, who sat in the front row. He had only his words and the hope that they would matter, that somehow truth would be enough, even when it rarely was. Your Honor, I'm not going to pretend I'm the best choice for these girls on paper. Mr. Thornton has more money, more stability, more everything. But I'd like to explain why I'm fighting for them anyway. He told the story simply finding the girls at the river crossing, reading James Harper's letter, bringing them to Millbrook, discovering Thornton's claim. He spoke about learning that their father had made an arrangement with Thornton, that the girls had been left where they would be found as part of a transaction, not as an act of love. The girls were currency in a deal, not children being cared for. Thornton's face tightened, but he said nothing, and Ben continued. I also learned that Grace was terrified of going with her grandfather, not because he'd hurt her physically, but because she was afraid of what would happen to Lily if certain truths came out. What truths? Judge Hartwell's voice was sharp. Ben hesitated. He had promised Grace he would not use this information, would not weaponize a child's parentage to win a court case. Your Honor, I prefer not to say. It's not relevant to my ability to care for the girls. Judge Hartwell studied him for a long moment, and Ben thought he saw something that might have been respect cross her face. Very well. What else? I married Emma Reed 3 days ago. Mr. Preston is correct that she has a legal husband in Boston. But what he didn't mention is why she left that husband. Ben gestured to Emma, and she stood, her face pale but her voice steady. Miss Reed, tell me about your marriage to Mr. Hendricks. We were married 2 years ago in Boston. It was arranged by our families to settle a debt. From the beginning, Robert was violent. He beat me regularly, told me it was his right as my husband. Robert Hendricks stood, his face flushing with manufactured outrage. That's a lie, Your Honor. My wife is unstable, prone to hysteria. I've brought medical documentation. Judge Hartwell held up a hand. You'll have your turn, Mr. Hendricks. Sit down. Robert sat, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. Continue, Miss Reed. 6 months ago I ran. I came west hoping to disappear. But Robert found me. 3 days ago he came to Millbrook and told me I had to return to Boston or he'd have me arrested for desertion. And Mr. Carter married you to prevent that. Yes, Your Honor. Emma's voice broke slightly. He knew it would hurt his case for the girls, but he married me anyway because I had nowhere else to turn. Judge Hartwell looked at Ben. Is that true, Mr. Carter? Yes, Your Honor. Why would you sabotage your own case? Ben thought about how to explain, how to make someone understand that some things mattered more than winning. Because if I'd walked away from someone in danger to improve my legal position, I would have proven I don't deserve to raise those girls. They need someone who does the right thing even when it costs everything. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Judge Hartwell made a note, her face unreadable. I'll take this under advisement. Mr. Preston, any other witnesses? Just one, Your Honor. We called Grace Harper to the stand. Grace stood and she looked impossibly small. Walking to the witness chair, the bailiff had to adjust the height so she could be seen over the railing, and Ben felt his heart clench as she settled into the seat, her small hands folded in her lap. Judge Hartwell's voice softened. Hello, Grace. Do you understand why you're here? Yes, ma'am, you're deciding where Lily and I should live. That's right. I'm going to ask you some questions. Just answer honestly. All right? Yes, ma'am. Preston approached first, his movements calculated to seem gentle and unthreatening. Grace, do you know who Mr. Thornton is? He's our grandfather, our mama's father. And has he been kind to you? Grace hesitated, and Ben could see her choosing her words carefully. Yes, sir. Does he love you? He says he does. But you don't want to live with him. Why is that? Grace looked at Ben, then back at Preston, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. Because he wants us for the wrong reasons. What reasons are those? Because he feels guilty about Mama dying. He thinks if he takes care of us, it will make up for what happened to her. But that's not love. That's just trying to fix his own feelings. Edward Thornton made a sound like he'd been struck, and Ben saw his face crumple before he caught himself, before he rebuilt the careful mask of composure. Preston pressed on, though Ben could see him struggling now. But Mr. Carter is a stranger. You've only known him a few weeks. How do you know he's not just trying to fix his own feelings too? Grace looked directly at Preston, and her eyes held a wisdom that seemed impossible for 8 years. Because Mr. Carter knows he can't fix what happened to the boy who died. He's not trying to replace that boy with us. He's just trying to do better next time. The simplicity of it silenced the room, and Ben felt something break open in his chest, some wall he'd been holding against, feeling too much against hoping too hard. Judge Hartwell leaned forward. Grace, what do you want? If you could choose, where would you live with Mr. Carter and Miss Emma? Why, Grace's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. Because they chose us. Not because we're useful or because we make them feel better about themselves. They chose us even when it made their lives harder. Her voice broke slightly. That's what family should be. People who choose you when choosing you cost them something. Preston tried to recover. But Mr. Thornton can give you things Mr. Carter cannot. Education opportunity, a real home. Grace shook her head. We already have a real home. It's not a place, it's the people who stay. Preston sat down, recognizing defeat, and Judge Hartwell looked at Grace with something that might have been respect. One more question, child. Is there anything else you think I should know? Grace glanced at Thornton. He was staring at his hands, his shoulders shaking slightly, and Ben saw Grace make a decision. Saw the moment she chose truth over fear. Your Honor, there's something grandfather doesn't know about Lily. The courtroom went very still. Grace. Ben said it quietly, a warning, but Grace shook her head. I have to. She turned back to Judge Hartwell. Lily isn't Papa's daughter. Mama had an affair before Lily was born. Papa knew, but he raised her anyway. I've been scared to tell anyone because I thought if grandfather knew, he wouldn't want both of us anymore. Every eye in the room turned to Edward Thornton. The old man's face was unreadable, a mask that gave nothing away, and the silence stretched out like wire pulled too tight. Is that true, Mr. Thornton? Judge Hartwell's voice cut through the tension. Thornton stood slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion, barely contained. I've known since the day Catherine died. She told me in the final moments, made me promise I'd take care of both her daughters, not just the one with my blood. He paused and his voice grew stronger. But Grace didn't know I knew. James never told them. He wanted to protect Lily from that truth, and I've kept Catherine's secret all these years out of respect for her wishes. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps, and Judge Hartwell's gavel cracked like a gunshot. Order, order in this court. Silence fell heavy and expectant. Grace, you think I'd abandon your sister because of blood? You think I'm that kind of man? Grace's tears fell freely now. I don't know what kind of man you are, grandfather. You scared Papa so bad he left us under a tree. You used lawyers and threats to get what you wanted. How was I supposed to know? Thornton's face crumpled. He sat down heavily, covering his face with his hands, and his shoulders shook with sobs he could no longer contain. Judge Hartwell waited, and the whole room waited, watching a man break apart in front of them. Finally, Thornton lowered his hands. His face was wet, ravaged by grief and guilt, and something that might have been understanding. I've made mistakes, terrible mistakes. He looked at Grace, and his voice was steady despite the tears. Your mother died because I worked her too hard. I knew she was pregnant. I knew she was struggling. But the ranch needed workers, and I needed money, and I put all of that ahead of my daughter's life. His voice broke. When she died, when I held her hand and felt her slip away, I swore I'd make it right somehow, that I'd take care of her children the way I failed to take care of her. He stood and faced Judge Hartwell. But you're right, Grace. I've been trying to fix my own guilt, not love you for who you are. Thornton's voice grew stronger. I withdraw my petition for custody. The courtroom exploded in chaos. Shocked voices, gasps of disbelief, and Judge Hartwell's gavel cracking repeatedly until silence returned. You're certain, Mr. Thornton, I am, Your Honor. Those girls deserve better than a guilty old man trying to buy redemption. He looked at Ben. They deserve someone who chose them freely, not from obligation or guilt, but from genuine care. Edward paused. Your Honor, I'd like to request visitation rights, not as a guardian, but as their grandfather. I want to be part of their lives, to know them, to let them know me, flaws and all. Judge Hartwell made a note. That can be arranged if Mr. Carter consents. Ben nodded. Of course. Before Judge Hartwell could continue, the courtroom doors opened. A man entered, moving slowly with the careful movements of someone in pain. He was thin, gaunt, leaning heavily on a crutch. His right leg ended at the knee, the pant leg pinned up. His face was weathered and pale, but his eyes were clear. Grace gasped. Papa! James Harper made his way down the aisle, and every eye followed him. He reached the front and steadied himself against a bench. Your Honor, forgive the interruption. My name is James Harper. I'm the father of Grace and Lily. Judge Hartwell studied him. Mr. Harper, we were told you were dead. Nearly was. James's voice was weak but determined. Gangrene took my leg. Nearly took my life. But I survived. Why didn't you come for your daughters? James's face twisted with pain. Because I didn't deserve them. I abandoned them under a tree like unwanted kittens. I made a deal with Thornton to save my own skin. What kind of father does that? Judge Hartwell's voice was quiet. The kind who was desperate and dying. What do you want, Mr. Harper? Kate looked at Grace and Lily. Lily had started crying, reaching for him, but Grace sat frozen, her face unreadable. I want to testify on behalf of Ben Carter. I want the court to know that he's a better man than I ever was, that those girls are safer with him than they ever were with me. Preston stood. Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Harper abandoned his legal responsibilities. His testimony shouldn't carry weight. Overruled. Judge Hartwell's voice was sharp. Mr. Harper, tell me about Ben Carter. James turned to look at Ben. I've never met him before today, but I've heard about him from letters Ruth Mitchell sent me while I was recovering in Omaha. I know he found my girls when he could have ridden past. I know he fought for them when everyone told him to give up. I know he married a woman in danger even though it would cost him custody. James's voice grew stronger. That's the kind of man I wish I'd been. The kind who does right even when it's hard, even when it costs everything. My daughters deserve that kind of man raising them. And what about you? Do you want your daughters back? James's face crumpled. More than anything. But wanting them isn't the same as deserving them. I gave up my rights when I left them under that tree. He pulled papers from his coat. These are signed documents relinquishing all parental rights. I had a lawyer draw them up in Omaha. He handed them to the bailiff. I want Ben Carter to have full legal custody, not shared, not temporary. Full. Grace stood from the witness chair. She walked slowly to where James stood, and he looked down at her, tears streaming down his weathered face. I'm sorry, baby girl. I'm so sorry. Grace stared at him for a long moment, and the whole courtroom held its breath. I forgive you, Papa, but I choose him. She pointed at Ben, and the gesture was small but absolute. James nodded, sobbing. I know you do, and that's exactly right. Grace turned away from her father and walked to Ben. She took his hand and stood beside him, her choice made visible for the entire courtroom to see. Lily ran from her seat to James, throwing her arms around his good leg. Papa, don't leave again. James knelt awkwardly, balancing on his crutch, and held Lily close. I'm not leaving, sweetheart. I'll be here in Millbrook. I'll visit. I'll be part of your life. But Mr. Carter is your papa now, you understand? Lily looked at Ben, then back at James. Can I have two papas? James smiled through his tears. Yeah, honey, I think you can. Judge Hartwell let the moment settle, then spoke, her voice cutting through the emotion filling the courtroom. This court will take a 30-minute recess. When we return, I'll deliver my ruling. She stood and left, and the courtroom erupted in conversation. Ben stood frozen, Grace's hand in his, watching James hold Lily. Edward Thornton sat alone, his face in his hands. Emma moved to Ben's side, her presence steady and grounding. It's not over yet. I know. But we have a chance. Ben squeezed her hand. We have more than that. We have the truth. The 30 minutes felt like hours. Ben, Emma, and the girls waited in a side room while the courthouse buzzed with speculation and gossip. James joined them, moving slowly on his crutch, and the air was thick with things unsaid, with history and hurt and hope all tangled together. Finally, Grace spoke. Papa, why did you really leave us at that river crossing? James sat heavily, and he looked old beyond his years. Because I knew Thornton was going to find us eventually. He had men looking, and I knew when he did, there'd be a fight in court I couldn't win. Grace's voice was steady. So you made a deal with him? James shook his head. No, I made it look like I made a deal with him. I told Thornton I'd leave you somewhere public where you'd be found. He thought I meant by his men, but I chose that specific spot for a reason. Ben felt something click into place. The river crossing where Daniel died. James looked at Ben. Mrs. Mitchell told me about you in letters before I even got sick. Told me about a young man who'd tried to save her stepson and failed, who'd been running from his guilt ever since. She said you were a good man, broken by one terrible moment. Ben's throat tightened. I gambled everything on the hope that you'd come back to Millbrook eventually, that you'd be at that crossing because it meant something to you, and that when you saw my girls, you wouldn't be able to walk away. You gambled your children's lives on a hope. Emma's voice was sharp. James met her eyes. I gambled on grief, making a man careful, on guilt, making him brave, on someone who'd failed once, doing everything in his power not to fail again. He looked at Ben, and I was right. The bailiff knocked. Judge is ready. They filed back into the courtroom. Judge Hartwell sat at her bench, papers arranged before her, her face unreadable. I've reviewed the evidence and testimony. This is one of the more unusual cases I've presided over. We have a grandfather withdrawing his petition, a biological father relinquishing rights, a questionable marriage, and two children caught in the middle of adult decisions. She looked at Grace and Lily. But at the center of all this complexity is a simple question. Who will best serve the interests of these children? Judge Hartwell's gaze moved to Ben. Mr. Carter, you have no money, no property, no legal training. You're living in a room behind a church and working for wages barely sufficient to feed yourself, let alone two growing girls. Ben's heart sank. But you also have something that cannot be bought or inherited. You have the willingness to sacrifice your own interests for theirs. You've demonstrated that repeatedly. And while that's not usually enough in this case, combined with Mr. Thornton's withdrawal and Mr. Harper's relinquishment, it tips the balance. Ben felt the room spin. I'm granting you full legal custody of Grace and Lily Harper with certain conditions. The courtroom erupted, and Ben couldn't breathe, couldn't process what he was hearing. Judge Hartwell continued over the noise. Miss Reed, or Mrs. Carter, or whatever we're calling you, your marriage to Mr. Carter is legally invalid due to your existing marriage to Mr. Hendricks. However, I'm issuing an emergency order annulling your marriage to Mr. Hendricks on grounds of coercion and domestic abuse. Robert Hendricks shot to his feet. You can't do that, I just did. Judge Hartwell's voice was ice. Furthermore, I'm issuing a restraining order. Mr. Hendricks, you are to stay at least 500 yards from Miss Reed at all times. You are to leave Millbrook immediately and not return. Violation will result in arrest. But she's my wife. Not anymore. The gavel cracked. Bailiff, escort Mr. Hendricks from my courtroom. Two deputies moved forward, and Robert's face went purple with rage, but he left without further protest, his plans crumbling around him. Judge Hartwell turned back to Ben and Emma. You two will remarry. Properly this time. Within 30 days. The custody order is contingent on that marriage taking place and remaining intact for a minimum of 1 year. This court wants to see stability, not just good intentions. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Thornton, you're granted visitation rights. 1 afternoon per week to be arranged with Mr. Carter. You will not attempt to undermine his authority or turn the children against him. Clear crystal, clear, Your Honor. Thank you. And Mr. Harper, you're also granted visitation. I recommend you use that time to build a relationship with your daughters based on honesty rather than guilt. I will, Your Honor. Judge Hartwell looked at the entire courtroom. Let this case stand as precedent. Family is not defined solely by blood or law or tradition. Family is defined by choice, by commitment, by the willingness to stand when standing is hard. Mr. Carter has demonstrated that more thoroughly than any blood relative could. Her gavel fell. Case dismissed. Custody granted. The courtroom erupted in noise and motion. Ben stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Emma's arms went around him. Grace and Lily crashed into them, both holding tight, and through the crowd, Ben saw James standing alone on his crutch. Their eyes met, and James nodded once, a gesture of respect and gratitude and goodbye. Then Edward Thornton appeared. The old man stood before Ben, his hat in his hands. Thank you for not turning me away completely. I don't deserve access to those girls, but I'm grateful for it. Ben extended his hand. They need to know all the people who love them, even the imperfect ones. Thornton shook his hand. That includes you, Carter, especially me. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun was bright and warm. Ben stood on the steps with Emma on one side and Grace and Lily on the other. Behind them, James and Edward stood together in an awkward alliance, two men who had made terrible choices, learning to make better ones. Mrs. Hayes appeared with a basket. I thought you might want to celebrate. There's a spot by the river that's nice this time of day. They walked together through town and people stared, but Ben didn't care. His family was whole. Broken, yes. Complicated, certainly. But whole. At the river crossing where he'd found the girls, they spread a blanket. Mrs. Hayes unpacked bread and cheese and apples, simple food that tasted like Grace. Grace sat between Ben and James, splitting her attention. Lily played at the water's edge, laughing when minnows darted around her toes. Papa, Grace said to James, why that place? Why that exact spot? James looked at the water. Because it was a place of endings, where that boy died, where Mr. Carter's old life ended. I figured it might also be a place of beginnings. Was it? James smiled sadly. Look around you, baby girl. What do you think? Grace looked at Ben and Emma, at the strange family assembled on the riverbank. Her smile was small, but real. Yeah, I think it was. As the sun lowered, they packed up. James said goodbye, promising to visit the following week. Edward did the same, his leave taking awkward but sincere. Mrs. Hayes walked back to town with Grace and Lily, giving Ben and Emma a moment alone. They stood at the water's edge, watching the current move past them, carrying leaves and twigs and everything that didn't hold fast to something solid. We have to get married again. Emma's voice held something that might have been amusement. Is that what you want? Emma was quiet. When I married Robert, I had no choice. When I married you, it was desperation. This time, she turned to look at him. This time it's a choice. And what are you choosing? A partnership? A family? A man who does the right thing even when it costs everything? She paused. That's not love. Not yet. But it's something that could become love given time. Ben squeezed her hand. Then let's give it time. They walked back to town as twilight fell, and the church was quiet when they arrived. Ben lit a lamp in his small room and sat on the edge of his cot. Through the window, he could see Daniel's grave in the cemetery, the stone that had haunted him for 15 months. But now looking at it, Ben felt something different. Not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance. The understanding that he could carry this grief without being crushed by it, could honor Daniel's memory by protecting the living instead of mourning the dead. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Grace stood there in her nightgown, barefoot. Can't sleep. Grace shook her head. She came in and sat beside him on the cot. Are you happy? Ben thought about it. I'm not sure I know what happy feels like anymore. But I'm at peace. That's close enough. Grace leaned against him. Thank you for not giving up on us. Thank you for giving me a reason not to. They sat in comfortable silence. Outside, the night settled over Millbrook. Somewhere in that darkness, James was finding a room to rent. Edward was returning to his ranch. Emma was sleeping in the church's upper room. All of them orbiting around this fragile thing Ben and the girls had built together, this chosen family that defied every convention and somehow worked anyway. Grace spoke again, her voice sleepy. Mr. Carter, can I call you Dad now? Or is it still too soon? Ben felt his throat close. You can call me whatever feels right. Grace was quiet for a moment. Then, Dad. The words settled into the space between them, simple and profound and true. Yeah, honey, I'm glad you stopped at that river. Ben pulled her close. Me too, Grace. Me too. She fell asleep against him, and Ben sat holding her, this child who had chosen him, and felt the weight of 15 months of running finally lift from his shoulders. He looked out the window at Daniel's grave, visible in the moonlight, the stone that had driven him away and brought him back and taught him that redemption came not from forgetting, but from remembering, from carrying ghosts with intention, from letting them remind him what mattered. Tomorrow would come. And for the first time in 15 months, Ben was ready for it. 6 months later, the cemetery at Millbrook looked different. Ben had spent the autumn tending it with new care, planting flowers that would bloom in spring. Each grave now had a marker that was level and clean, each plot free of weeds. He stood at Daniel's grave on a Sunday afternoon, placing fresh wildflowers at the base of the stone. Grace and Lily played nearby, their voices carrying across the quiet space. Grace reading under a tree, Lily chasing butterflies with a kind of pure joy that only children who felt safe could manage. Footsteps approached. Ben looked up to see Edward Thornton, well-dressed as always, but softer around the edges, the hard lines of guilt beginning to ease. Afternoon, Carter. Thornton. The old man stood beside Ben, looking at Daniel's grave. The boy who started all this in a way. Ben nodded. Everything connects. We just don't always see how. Edward gestured to where the girls played. They look happy. They are. Most days. And you, Ben considered. Getting there, more footsteps. James appeared moving easier now, on his prosthetic leg, working odd jobs in town, saving money, building something resembling a life. The three men stood together in awkward camaraderie, the father who'd abandoned the grandfather who tried to control the stranger who'd chosen to stay. This is strange, the three of us here. Life is strange. We just have to decide if we're going to fight it or flow with it. Ben looked at both of them. You're both welcome at dinner tonight. Emma's making stew. I'd like that. James said it quietly. Edward nodded. As would I. From across the cemetery, Lily's voice rang out. Dad, come see what Grace found. Ben smiled. The words still caught him, sometimes still felt like grace he hadn't earned. Coming, honey. He started to walk away, then turned back. You're both coming at 6 o'clock. We'll be there, Edward said. James just nodded, emotion clear on his face. As Ben walked away, he heard Edward's voice, quiet but carrying. We're lucky, you know, that he didn't give up. James's response was equally soft. He's lucky we gave him a reason not to. Ben pretended not to hear, but he smiled. That evening, the small house Ben had rented near the church was full of people and noise and life. Emma had outdone herself with dinner, and the table was crowded with James, Edward, Mrs. Hayes, Ruth Mitchell, and the girls. They ate and talked and laughed, and it wasn't perfect. James and Edward still had moments of awkward tension. The girls still had nightmares sometimes. Emma still flinched at loud noises. But they were trying, all of them, trying to be family assembled from broken pieces. After dinner, Lily climbed into Emma's lap, the gesture so natural now that Ben barely noticed. But then Lily asked a question that made everyone freeze. Miss Emma, can I call you Mama? Grace says I should ask first. Emma's eyes filled with tears. She looked at Ben and he nodded. If you want to, honey, I'd be honored. Lily smiled, bright and beautiful. Okay, Mama. The word hung in the air, and Emma held Lily close and cried quietly into her golden curls. Grace appeared at Ben's elbow with something in her hand, a piece of paper old and creased. What's that? The letter Papa left with us. I've been carrying it all this time, but I think maybe it's time to let it go. Ben took the letter, read James's desperate words again. He looked at James across the room, and the man was watching his face, unreadable. Their eyes met, and James raised his glass slightly in salute. Ben raised his in return, understanding passing between them. Grace spoke quietly. Can I tell you something? Of course. Papa didn't just hope someone would find us. He knew. Grace's voice was matter of fact. He told me before he left. He said he'd watched you for days coming back to Millbrook. He knew you'd be at that river crossing eventually. And he knew when you saw us, you wouldn't leave. Ben stared at her. He planned it. Grace nodded. He said sometimes the best parents aren't the ones who give birth. They're the ones who choose to stay. Later, after everyone had gone home and the girls were in bed, Ben and Emma sat on their small porch. The night was cool, stars bright overhead. This is real, isn't it? This family we've built. Emma's voice was soft. Ben took her hand. It's real. I keep waiting for it to fall apart. It might. Nothing's guaranteed. But we'll face it together if it does. Emma leaned her head on his shoulder. I love you. You know, I don't think I've said that yet. Ben felt the words settle into his chest, warm and true. I love you too. When did you know? Ben thought about it. When you stood up to Robert in that hotel lobby. When you refused to run anymore. That's when I knew you were the strongest person I'd ever met. And that made you love me. That made me want to be worthy of you. They sat in silence, holding hands, watching the stars wheel overhead. Inside, their daughter slept peacefully. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they had this: peace, family, home. Not the home Ben had been born into, not the home he'd dreamed of as a young man, but the home he'd built with his own hands from broken pieces and desperate choices. The kind of home that mattered, the kind worth fighting for. Ben thought about Daniel one more time, about the river and the drowning and the 15 months of running. He thought about the guilt that had driven him and the redemption he'd found, not by forgetting, but by remembering, by carrying his ghost with intention, by letting them remind him what mattered. Thank you. He whispered it to the darkness, to Daniel, to the Reverend, to all the people who had forgiven him when he couldn't forgive himself. Emma squeezed his hand. What are you thankful for? Ben looked at the house where his daughter slept, at his wife beside him, at the life he'd stumbled into by stopping when wisdom said to keep moving. Everything, all of it. And he meant it. Ben Carter had learned what redemption looked like. Not in forgetting the past, but in honoring it by protecting the present. Not in running from ghosts, but in letting them walk beside him as reminders of what mattered. He had failed once. The river had taught him that trying wasn't always enough. But the crossing had taught him something else. That showing up mattered, that choosing to stay when staying was hardest was its own kind of victory. And sometimes that was all the redemption a broken man could hope for. The ghosts we carry don't disappear. They walk beside us, reminding us of what we've lost, what we failed to save. But sometimes, if we're brave enough, we can turn them into reasons to fight instead of reasons to run. Ben locked the door, turned off the lamp, and joined Emma in their small bedroom. Through the window, the cemetery was visible in the moonlight, Daniel's grave among the others. Ben no longer feared it. It was a reminder now, not a haunting. A reminder that second chances existed. That redemption came through action, not forgiveness. That family was choice, not blood. Emma was already asleep. Ben lay beside her, listening to her breathe. In the next room, Grace and Lily slept as daughters, now legally and truly. Tomorrow would bring new days, new challenges. But tonight, this was enough. The water still ran dark at Blackwood's crossing. But Ben Carter no longer feared it. He had crossed to the other side, and he was home.